What is going on, Metaverse? Animositas here, and I'm super excited to be joined today by a very special guest. Ryan Horrigan is the co-founder and CEO of the Artieverse Web3 gaming project. The Artieverse is one of the largest Web3 projects in existence today, and Ryan and his team have come from across the entertainment industry. Ryan has several decades of experience, including with Paramount and Fox, and they've joined us today to talk about how they're building mobile gaming that hits differently. So, Ryan, I'd be really interested, tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to Web3 gaming from more traditional industries in media and entertainment.
Yeah, well, I mean, to answer that question, I have to go all the way back to childhood. I was essentially obsessed with computers and creativity on computers, particularly Apple computers as a kid. And I was obsessed with storytelling, particularly, cinema. So I was a cinemaphile as a child, basically. But every summer I would go to Macworld, whether it was in Boston. This is the East Coast version, not the San Francisco version, but there was one in Boston. They ended up moving it to the Javits Center. I'd roam the halls. I'd go listen to Steve Jobs keynotes. I'd come out of there with some sort of piece of software that was going to kind of help me scratch that creative itch. So it could have been early versions of Photoshop and Illustrator, first versions of Final Cut Pro, the first sort of MIDI controllers and MIDI software for making music, 3D modeling like early Lightwave and Maya. So I was always sort of looking for something that had a technical component to it, but also a creative component to it. That led me sort of to make a decision. Am I going to go into, technology and go to Silicon Valley, or am I going to go to Hollywood? And at the time, there wasn't a way to reconcile those two interests. So I ended up going to Hollywood, focusing on a career in entertainment, essentially working towards being a film producer by way of being a studio executive first, which is typically one of the paths to get there. Did that for over a decade and had climbed my way pretty much halfway up the food chain, was overseeing a slate of about 30 film projects. These are like screenplays in development based on books, comic books, original ideas, working with writers, directors, packaging movies, overseeing their production. And, basically ended my career by overseeing the movie 12 Years a Slave. We won Best Picture, which was sort of not where we thought we'd be when we first started. But I found myself like really wanting to leave the film business and to take that leap into technology because I felt like not very satisfied. So when I got my first demo of the Oculus pre-Facebook buying them in 2015, I kind of was blown away. And I realized immediately this is what I wanted to go work on. There's a lot of question marks, but I realized at the time that this was what I'd been looking for, something at the nexus of storytelling and the future of entertainment and technology, where not only could we tell great stories, but we could innovate on what storytelling actually is in a new medium. So in VR, that was very difficult. That was sort of placing the viewer subjectively inside the content and giving them a role quite often. And it created a lot of kind of challenges narratively speaking. And also VR had its early struggles in terms of adoption, marketing, and kind of finding its use case. And still today, I would say it's a long way away from where ultimately it may end up. And somewhere along that path, I met my co-founder, Armando. He was also obsessed with the idea of what is the future of entertainment and how are we going to get there and what are the qualities. And he was also working at a rival VR company, and our two companies were some of the biggest, most well-funded companies. But we both realized that we had hit this sort of glass ceiling in VR. It was not, in our view, ready for prime time in the way that we had imagined it. So we kind of felt like there was more to do on mobile, and that mobile would still remain the dominant platform for quite some period of time. We were both gamers growing up, but I wouldn't consider ourselves like hardcore gamers, although we played hardcore games at times, but just broadly gamers across platforms, PC, console, etc. And we were really interested in new ideas like communally created content, content that is never ending or sort of persists across platforms, content that places you in an active role in the content that's participatory. So yeah, a lot of these things were the reasons why we were in VR. And when we started Artie, we actually started with a focus that's completely different than what we're doing now. And after about a year, we pivoted into what we're doing now. So initially, we were working with a bunch of PhD AI scientists to pioneer developer technology that worked in tandem with Unity. So game developers could bring voice and computer vision into their games to have multimodal game input into games. So imagine particularly on your phone, rather than just playing games with your thumbs, what if you could talk to your favorite game characters and have conversations that then on the back end were driving choices in terms of where the gameplay would go, in addition to sort of what you did with your thumbs, on the screen? Or could we use the camera on the phone to recognize your level of engagement or objects or facial expressions to make a more personally tailored gameplay experience? Now, a lot of this stuff can get you into the realm of Black Mirror and some questionable conversations around ethics. But long story short, we kind of found that while we had solved a lot of the input things in terms of speech recognition, natural language understanding, and we were beginning to solve some of the output things like procedural animation and real-time speech synthesis. Some of the more difficult things were generative dialogue and some of the stuff that OpenAI purports to do with GTP3 and all the stuff they're working on. But what we found is if you want to have a believable, say, Marvel character, on the one hand, you can narrow that focus, which helps you. But on the other hand, the bar is pretty high for passing believability. So we kind of felt like it wasn't quite time for this. But while we were doing this, we were cooking up some technology in the background that ultimately became the centerpiece of what Artie is today. And that led us sort of into Web3 and the possibilities surrounding NFTs in games. So I'll stop there because that's the beginning. And of course, everything thereafter is kind of what we're doing now.
Yeah. No, I think that's awesome. One of the pieces that I really love with your background is that it really feels like you're going for a much more immersive experience with your audience. And what I think I heard you sharing with us is that some of the technology wasn't really ready to deliver that earlier. And I think that gets us to, what is the unique proposition that you feel Artieverse brings? How are you trying to cross other entertainment mediums and gaming in a very unique way by combining that with Web3 technology?
Yeah. So while we were working on this technology, this AI technology, we were working with one of the biggest IP holders in the world, with one of the biggest superhero IPs in the world. And we were actually working on the pilot for a voice-driven game. Kind of think of it like a voice-driven Telltale game, if you remember those, like a narrative game where normally you kind of hit these inflection points and you make choices. It's a choose your own adventure, essentially, not dissimilar from like Netflix's Bandersnatch and these kind of things. But we were actually creating like way larger potential outcomes where characters were asking you more open-ended questions. And then we were looking for keywords that we'd bring into like, word vectors that would triangulate with different possible groups of words. So bottom line is, like, a character could ask you, what's your favorite ice cream? You could kind of say anything, and then we would probably be able to route you to the most appropriate outcome or answer. But that may have been as few as a few outcomes, like 3, or it may have been 4 dozen, which is quite cumbersome in terms of like how much content you have to create to do that. So in a weird way, we found paradoxically,
right there.
Yeah, like paradoxically, AI is supposed to make things easier, and we found it was making things harder from a production standpoint, especially if you're in this kind of branching narrative kind of structure, which we found was like most native for that. Anyway, long story short, while we were doing this, the IP holder said, hey, it would be awesome if we could do this as a web game so we could leverage our social accounts, which get millions and millions of eyeballs, especially when we're activating movie trailers and promotional items. So we could draft off of that stuff. What if we could let our audience play this game directly from an Instagram bio link, or the description of a YouTube video drafting off of a movie trailer, or from a tweet or a Facebook post? So we kind of said, oh, well, that's really interesting. We're big proponents of the free and open web and web games in general, and what's going on with WebGL and WebAssembly. However, we kind of feel like with web languages like HTML5 and JavaScript, despite the fact that there's been improvements that have opened up new doors for game developers, you're still fairly limited. Like, you kind of only see hyper casual games more or less made with HTML5 or JavaScript. So you have kind of like this ceiling for graphics quality, complexity, and scope. And if you look at the people who create those games, they usually do so for Facebook or Snapchat, or maybe soon for ByteDance and TikTok, or for WeChat. So typically it's social platforms that are commissioning these instant games for their own gaming programs, which are typically for the retention and delight of their own users, or sometimes they run ads on them so that the game developers can turn a profit. But other times they're just paid as a service provider to make the game, and then there's kind of no upside. So kind of 2 things. We realized that the technology was a limitation in terms of going beyond hyper casual into what you'd call, I guess, casual, mid-core, core mobile games. And those are typically games made in Unity or Unreal that have app downloads and go through app stores. But also there was this sort of business model constraint, which is the minute you put your game inside of Snapchat or Facebook's gaming program, Apple considers that part of Snapchat or Facebook, and thus you are not allowed to monetize that game transactionally with credit cards. It can only be free or ad supported, which has sort of been grandfathered in from Zynga days with Farmville and Facebook. But if you wanted to monetize a game with a credit card, you would have to be a standalone app, go through the App Store and pay Apple and Google their 30% cut. So what we kind of realized is if you're going to make a casual, mid-core, or core mobile game, and those rely on like this type of monetization, they can't just survive with ads because they're more expensive to make, more expensive to market. They would be at a loss if they were just running ads. That this also wouldn't be a path through this sort of certain paradigm we were seeing with kind of HTML5 JavaScript games going through these platforms. So we then looked at cloud gaming, which everyone kind of knows enough about. And most people, when they talk about the challenges with cloud gaming and Google Stadia or other things, they talk about latency. And most people are kind of smart enough to realize that, yeah, you probably have a better chance to overcome latency at home with like fast broadband or gigabit internet comparatively to, say, mobile connections, even with 5G today, at least in the West, right? But the thing that we found was more critical was the operational cost of how expensive it is to render graphics in the cloud on the server's GPUs. So, if you're Amazon or Google and you're, you own the cloud, it's, by our estimates as of a year or so ago, which could have changed, about 35 to 40 cents per player per hour for an average game to render graphics in the cloud. If you're a startup or Facebook, it could be upwards of almost 90 cents per player per hour. So if you're in the pay-to-play gaming business, like PC and console business, and you're Google Stadia and you're charging people $10 a month for the service and the older kind of B-list games that, let's be honest, no one really wants to play, but you're still charging people $60+ to buy each game on top of that, you can see they can kind of hide that 35 cents an hour cost structure within those two kind of fees that they're charging you. So they're kind of charging you like iTunes and Netflix at the same time. So the minute you bring that cost structure over to mobile to free to play, you have a problem because you're basically losing somewhere between 35 cents if you're Amazon or Google, or probably closer to 90 cents if you're a gaming company like us. Imagine losing 90 cents per player per hour from 97% of your players who buy nothing, who are free to play players. That's not a sustainable business. In fact, it's far worse than paying Apple and Google 30%, right? So what we realized is there must be a hybrid or some other approach. So what we kind of tried to do was work with some of the folks at Unity and some of their more bleeding edge technology. And we kind of saw their vision for the future of their own game engine. And we decided to kind of get on board with some of that earlier stuff and build in front of it and around it. So that we could, hopefully be one of the first to market with this kind of new technology, which allows you to create kind of smaller game code and more kind of efficient games in the way in which you write the code in C#, but also how the games are ultimately packaged and, among other things, in the tools you use. So in doing that, we were able to essentially kind of, on the one hand, control the game like any server authoritative mobile game, but maybe with a little bit more of like kind of the underpinnings of a cloud game from a decision-making and logic standpoint. But what we were able to do was really optimize the game code file size, the asset file size, and the animation file size, stream all that data down to your phone, unpack that through the open web standards that web games use, WebAssembly and WebGL, but run a micro runtime of Unity's renderer and render a C# Unity game in the web browser of TikTok on your phone. So that's basically what we built. And the net outcome of that is higher quality web games. It just so happens they're a little bit more controlled on the cloud, but they're also still rendered on your phone using your phone's GPU. So when we did that, we kind of realized, okay, I think we can run casual, mid-core, or core mobile games in Unity that would be indistinguishable from an app-based version that would go through Apple and Google. So that was a huge epiphany. And then the next question was, well, who's it for? And when we looked at the gaming market, we felt like there was a massive, very appealing white space that no one was tackling, and it was a certain age group. And primarily, I would say it's 18 to 30-year-olds, but to kind of zoom out even further, it's 13 to 30-year-olds. So if you kind of look at like the data from App Annie or Sensor Tower, there's kind of two groups that do really well in mobile gaming. People 30 to 50 years old who've been playing mobile games already for 10 plus years when they started. They were probably, 18 to 20 when they started playing mobile games, and now they're 30 on the low end and they're 50 on the high end. And even more than men, women are the biggest spenders, as a lot of people know, in mobile games, particularly match 3 games, choose your adventure narrative games, romance games. Women are by far the biggest spenders, and that's where you see a lot of the emphasis put by the establishment publishers. Then the other group is family or kids games, 12 and under. So IP-driven games, SpongeBob, Looney Tunes, Roblox, right? These are actually games that mom and dad probably download and put on their own phone or tablet for the kids, and then they make the purchases. And then you're really not seeing anyone, and I'm saying anyone kind of flippantly, but like by and large, you're not seeing any of the mobile gaming publishers make games for 13 to 30-year-olds. And I guess if you're 13 to 18, it kind of makes sense. You don't have disposable income. Mom and dad don't want to buy you the type of game content you probably want to play or buy. And if you're 18 to 30, though, you are actually a good consumer, probably with a job and disposable income without a family or like a mortgage. But none of them are really playing mobile games, which is strange. And it was strange to us because we were like, no one's on their phones more than, older Gen Z and younger millennials, this kind of age group we're talking about, but they're not playing mobile games. They're playing PC games, they're playing console games. And often those games enter the zeitgeist and are part of culture, and broadly speaking, there's many more games, but the obvious ones, Fortnite, League of Legends, Call of Duty, Among Us, Fall Guys, these are all games that started on the PC, some of which crossed over to mobile. They're all aided by Discord and Twitch, but they benefited through streamers and influencers and the network effects that async video content brings. If you look at mobile games, there's almost no mobile game I could think of today that's relevant, that is a part of culture or that has a strong community. If you think of almost any game by one of these major publishers, I would be surprised if anyone could say, yeah, there's a really strong community there. Everyone knows each other. They're all in it together. They meet up. They rep the brand. To me, it kind of seems similar to my days in the movies. If you go to see a movie by Paramount or Universal, most people, your average viewer, has no brand affinity for that studio. They just care who's the actor in it or what's the IP, right? With the exception of Disney. Disney's probably the only brand where people actually show up because it's a Disney movie, right? So what we started to realize is the same thing's true in the gaming space. People do on PC and console show up because of who made the game and what games they made before, but on mobile, that's not true. So we kind of realized, well, heck, if we can bring games over the top, circumventing app stores, direct to this audience that's been ignored, that spends the majority of their time in these 5 or 6 social or video streaming apps, and we can let them discover this gaming content the same way they discover photos and video and articles. And now for the first time, they can discover and play games right there, say inside of TikTok's embedded browser from a link in bio or from a tweet in Twitter or from a message in Discord. That could be really powerful in this idea of going to try to capture that underserved audience, right? So once we kind of figured all that out, and that was the angle we wanted to take, we realized that user acquisition could potentially be vastly improved comparatively to mobile games. Like if you're spending money to acquire players with paid media or influencer campaigns, you usually have some friction or abandonment in getting them to actually go to the app store and download the app, right? There's some drop off there. But if you're actually serving them the game that they can play within a moment, right from the ad itself, right inside the social network where they saw the ad or they saw the influencer content, you're going to probably have higher conversion. You're going to have better customer acquisition costs, right? But on the downside, in theory, you might have far worse retention because if you don't have that app icon on your phone, how are you going to get that visibility with that consumer every day to remind them to play that game? Then you kind of have to look back at Zynga, 10 plus years ago, predominantly with, moms and stuff, I'm going to generalize there, where they had to learn and be trained that they play this game on Facebook, right? Now, Zynga had the benefit of having API access and integration so they could leverage notifications and things like this that ultimately annoyed most of us who didn't want to play the game, we got those notifications. But it was ultimately their undoing because that's what allowed Apple to put pressure on Facebook to push Zynga out into app stores and to abandon this sort of model to some degree. So what we kind of realized is we're never going to want to have a direct technology related relationship or first party kind of second party business relationship with the social networks. What we want to do is function more like an influencer. We want to treat our games as if they're influencers, build communities around them with async video content and memes, and create really deep brand love or brand affinity and keep the games top of mind across various social channels within the community that loves the games. And then hopefully that community will love the games so much that they'll help us acquire their friends so that, again, we can retain these people by keeping the game and its content top of mind, but we can also acquire new people right at the site in which you play the game. So kind of acquisition, community, and gameplay can all happen at the same origin spot, right? Whereas if you look at a PC game, acquisition starts somewhere else, the gameplay is separate, and so is the community on Twitch and Discord. Those are three separate adjacent destinations, right? So as we were thinking more about this, we realized that NFTs in games, or particularly, ownable game assets, would be the key to driving retention and sort of answering that question of how do we get people to come back. When we were paying attention to NFTs in late 2020, and then of course early 2021, when most of us really started to pay attention, we immediately saw what a lot of people saw, which is people changing the profile pictures on Twitter. Now, of course, now in 2022, a little bit of that on Instagram too, on other platforms. And we saw, these people are like repping these brands. They're wearing the merch. They're taking photos in real life, and they're helping to acquire their friends organically because they have a vested interest in this asset. They have skin in the game, right? So we kind of felt like, well, that obviously should come to gaming. But if it's just a part of like core games on PC, it feels like a missed opportunity, like where we actually can traffic in the same place that Bored Ape Yacht Club and CryptoPunks has thrived, social media, especially if our actual games that give those NFTs utility are also playable there. So kind of the last thing I'll leave you with, and I'll turn it over to you, is imagine if you could lean into mobile gaming or gaming on social media and NFTs, like what a powerful vortex that could be if you got that right.
Mm-hmm. So I think the piece that's most intriguing to me is that many brands in gaming came from like other entertainment channels and mediums. Where you look at something like Star Wars, you had movies first, or Marvel, where you had other comic books that were the genesis point. And oftentimes, I think you see these brands then move into gaming instead. So it's not so often that you really see the reverse is true. Maybe like Pokemon or something where there was more of a gaming first and then transition to other mediums. What's really interesting to me is that you're approaching this from day one as your brand is you have gaming utility that you're an integrated part of, and you see that integration between you and the observer and the viewer as you with the gaming participant with a growing IP across different mediums and channels for the fans of the franchise to really latch on to.
I think it depends on what time in history you enter the consumer space with a new piece of IP, right? Like, so if you were entering the fray in the 1960s, the medium of choice would be comic books, and you'd have kids lining up outside of comic book stores for Marvel, right? And that probably was true for many decades, right? If you were talking about like where culture and zeitgeist live, and I mean like youth culture in particular, in the 80s and 90s, it was movie theaters probably. That's where culture lived. At least for me growing up, that's where it lived. And to some extent arcades too, right? Like they were both at the mall typically. And then I think it's become more blurry over the last 20 years or so. But today, I think unequivocally, it would be fair to say that gaming, by people who really know, is the place where culture is set more than anywhere else. I think you could still give music a lot of credit too. Like the music industry still kind of sets culture, and sure, sports. But I think the weight that like film and TV carry has been diminished to some degree, particularly theatrical film. Maybe you could argue, yeah, there's certain shows on Netflix that really enter the zeitgeist, like Stranger Things, but there's such an abundance of content there that it's really hard to make an impact comparatively to, like, say, the 1980s, where there was only 12 marquee movies who came out in a summer, right? So like when Jaws comes out, there was only like 12 options that summer, and Jaws was the coolest one, right? So today we all have like small niches that we kind of are a part of on these like platforms like Netflix. So it's really hard to see these like larger zeitgeisty moments. I think in gaming, that is not the case though. Gaming, what's so interesting about gaming is obviously it's been building in popularity over, I think now at this point, almost 40 years. Like it's pretty crazy, 40 plus years if you really think about it. But it has unique qualities, right? It's appointment viewing, which I know is so important, like to like broadcasters still, like sports and news are the only things that check that box. So like digitally on your phone or on your console or your PC, it's appointment viewing. It's like you want to be there live in that moment. You know, it's not like an async experience, right? If you're going to participate. But what's also awesome is there is an async experience. Like there's streamers who are, you know, recording video or live streaming that then I can consume later. So it has this sort of like ripple effect where you can reach a lot of people either in real time who are all there communally in one moment, or you can get them later with the video content. So I think today in 2022, if you want to be a part of youth culture, there's no greater wedge, in my opinion, than mobile gaming, and particularly games that can be played in the social layer, which I think we've only seen a certain type of game that can be played there, and they're not very cool. They're for predominantly older people. So put it a different way, think of it as the modern arcade. If I would go to the arcade in the 90s and play like really edgy left of center games that I probably wouldn't want to tell my mom about when I got home, but I was with all my friends, what's the equivalent of that today in Discord or on TikTok, right? Like, these are the type of games we're making. Like Run the Table is,
Right.
A Clash style game, which is a proven kind of game genre or game loop. But on the surface of it, it's beer pong meets Mortal Kombat. It's like one of the most popular games amongst youth culture today and historically, mashed up with a game that a lot of people have like a nostalgia for, but also is still culturally relevant. So it also makes the game more fun too. So you just wouldn't see that type of game in like Apple's App Store.
True.
So I think the kind of things that we aspire to make, they also have to be highly fun to play, but culturally relevant, or at least have the DNA for that. So the distribution piece that we've created alone isn't enough. It's like you have to be able to have a game-changing distribution element, but also make really cool games that feel like they're moving the needle, at least on the platform of mobile, where they've been largely kind of, the same over the last many years.
And I think an interesting piece here is most of the vision that you shared doesn't actually require Web3 to work, right? You could address all of those topics that you've really outlined without having the asset ownership that NFTs brings. But I think actually part of the distinct advantage is when you add that, let's say, edginess of Web3 on top of it. Yes, you have a better user experience and that they actually have some ownership and some more skin in the game to the project, but it also is, feels almost a little countercultural as well, which is where, I think you're trying to take the project overall.
Yeah. Well, and also like if you're going direct to consumer to, say 18 to 35-year-olds or 18 to 40-year-olds, we'll see exactly what the true segment is for us. Like it might be way more narrow, but like to start, we're probably going to really look at like 18 to 40 and then see like what the real, segmentation is. But like we do know that 18 to 30 is this ignored demographic. So I think you could kind of say, well, yeah, if you're going over the top, as one would put it in the TV business, right, or film business, you're going over the top outside of the establishment. You're circumventing them, so you don't have to pay them, but also not go through their kind of curation. That's already kind of anti-establishment and kind of counterculture, right? So then like the idea is like, it's all about player empowerment. Like we have a direct relationship with you, the player. We're going directly to you with no middlemen. And you are owning, a piece of the game. Essentially, you could look at it like a fractionalized piece of the game IP. You could look at it like, an asset. Again, I think there's different player types. One thing that we talk a lot about, and we use this as like a guide for Artie, we often say that like, from a creative standpoint, we aspire to be like a modern Nintendo meets like Supreme in a weird way. And we often will say to ourselves, like, that's a really interesting kind of combination. So like, imagine if Nintendo launched today with its Mario IP, which was a whole host of characters, obviously Mario, Luigi, and all the others. But what if you could own a fractionalized piece of that IP? I could own one of 10,000 Marios, right?
Sure. Yeah, maybe you own Bowser, one specific iteration of him or whatever.
Right. Exactly. And then if you wanted to lean into the narrative conceit of that, you could say that it's like a multiverse and there's different versions of Bowser, and that's why there's 10,000 Bowsers, or maybe there's less, right? Okay. So what if that was true? What if like the Mario IP was launched today on the blockchain and anyone could own a piece of that IP effectively? But what if also you could play it anywhere, like via a link, or like, in today's world, right on your phone where everyone spends most of their time? Okay, that's cool. So accessibility, direct to consumer, ownership. And then what if, shortly thereafter, Nintendo was like, you know what? All these assets are on the blockchain. Let's open this up and let anyone make games in this ecosystem, as long as you adhere to like a couple of simple like truths or rules, like treat the IP well, like make any game you want using any technology or game engine you want, distribute it anywhere you want. But if you want to tap into this IP, it will help all boats rise together, right? And if some of the early creators, whether it's Artie or a couple of second party relationships we may have, coming up, in the near future, that hopefully lays the groundwork for other developers who want to come in. And I think Roblox has really set the stage for the future, which is, you don't need to focus on just professional game development studios. You can focus on, I guess, what you'd call like bedroom creators or amateur game developers. more and more people are learning game development in film school, for example. Or game development is becoming more graphical and less code-based. So probably like by the end of the decade, you won't even need to code. And there's already startups like solving that problem on top of Unity and Unreal, right? So I think game development is becoming democratized. It's still more difficult than creating video, obviously. So it's a smaller group of creators. But, I think there's something interesting there. Now, I know you had a question about tokens and stuff, which maybe is going to come later, but it's a nice kind of segue to that. So you had asked in like a pre-screening, like, hey, would you guys ever launch a token? I think if you were trying to build like a Web3 Roblox for, say, older people, older than 12, right? 18 plus.
Yeah.
You could potentially speed up developer ecosystem adoption with a token. So the way that you could do that is if you've launched a few successful games and the community has really bought into the success of what that gaming company and perhaps a couple of other third-party or second-party developers have done. I think once you have enough trust, you have enough proof out there and potentially some network effects between the games, you could then say launch a governance token for the community to govern themselves and greenlight their own games from the community, and then use the token that's reserved in a treasury to fund the games. Now, what that could do, if you do that at the right moment, it could accelerate adoption, because look at Roblox. It took them 16 years from where they started to IPO. Part of that was they went on their own journey. It was iterative, but part of that was they just by word of mouth had to get kids to become game developers, basically, which is even harder because kids as game developers is probably harder than 28-year-olds as game developers. And then eventually it did become 28-year-olds probably for Roblox. But I think that's an interesting idea of like the community essentially, surveying projects and then funding them, whether it's, two ad execs who want to hire a game studio in Argentina, or it's like a small team that's kind of from the mobile gaming establishment, but is sick of working in the app ecosystem and being last in the waterfall to make money, right? So I think that's a potentially interesting idea, and that's where Artie really hopes to go in the long term.
So it sounds like that's one kind of element around crowdsourcing for for the overall funding of developments, right? So you get fans that are really focused on the IP and they want to become involved directly. Another element is really how you manage the overall NFT process from mint and creation to sales to giveaways, additional drops. So what would you say is your approach when you're trying to make sure this connection with the real world economy is sustainable? So how you're handling that because that's for 18 to 30-year-olds, I mean they have more disposable income than 12 to 18-year-olds for sure, but it's a real concern, I think, given where we've seen the industry emerge from.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to be clear, like we're not making what I think people would classify as play to earn games. Based on your paradigm, I would say we're play and earn or play and own or some sort of place in between the two. Because it's about the game being first, but we are trying to play to kind of two sides or a couple of different segments. So on the one hand, I think like any culturally relevant game, if you were to look at like Fortnite's user base, it'd probably be safe to say, and I haven't looked at any data, I'm just making a broad assumption, but I'm pretty sure it's true, that by and large, the free-to-play players, which is the vast majority, are probably the youngest players, right? So the teenagers who play in mass probably spend the least amount of money, would be my guess. But unless, of course, it's like their parents' money, right? So maybe there's some money trafficking there. But probably by and large, your biggest whales or consistent whales are probably over the age of 18 and they have disposable income. So you kind of see this kind of thing with culturally relevant PC and console games where, if they're free to play, the kind of youth culture, younger element shows up in mass to play the game, to spread the word and to acquire their friends. But probably it's the slightly older player group that spends the real money, right? And that's true, I would say, across many consumer-facing businesses. Like it's probably not a leap to say for Supreme that when they're selling, $50 to $100 items like T-shirts and hoodies, they sell those to younger people more on average. But then when they're selling $10,000 pinball machines, it's probably an older purchaser, right? So when we think about that with NFTs, you kind of have, you have this NFT community that's on Twitter and Discord that, by and large, I would say is probably 25 to early 40s. And these are people who are probably fairly educated, dabble in holding Bitcoin, maybe trade a little bit on Robinhood. And they're speculating, right? Like they're owning NFTs, to speculate to some degree. And then there's another group that's maybe speculating, but also believes in the long-term value or utility of the project, like hopefully with many people that are part of the Artie community. But then you have this other category of people who don't even know about NFTs. They don't even care. And they just want to play a really fun game, right? So I think you can kind of look at it like that. Like, okay, if you're selling NFTs quarterly, like in like these gaming seasons, like akin to Fortnite, having these different seasons and different collabs with like IP holders like Marvel, it's like Marvel month, and we do the game skins for Marvel. For Artie, like the plan is to sort of cater to both sides, to create sort of a two-sided marketplace in a way, or another way to put it is more of a flywheel. So if collectors are essentially buying some portion of each drop in a primary sale because they think that there will be value behind these items based on the amount of players that are coming in or the adoption they're seeing, then they might be willing to buy these NFTs. Also, they're not necessarily trying to spend 20 hours that month in the game trying to be atop the leaderboard and be the best player or be one of the top 5% of players, right? So in a way, those people kind of set the floor price or the price target for the younger group who maybe don't have the financial means to partake in the primary sale for a couple $100s, but they're willing to play their asses off for 10 hours that month to try to get atop the leaderboard or win certain tournaments or, what have you, various different ways to earn NFTs. And then they kind of know what they're playing for because the floor price is kind of already set or this price target. So conceivably that would drive, if the game is fun, more players, sort of chasing the idea that there's this limited supply of already valuable NFTs, which if more players come, then perhaps the secondary market gets driven up because there are collectors who want to pay higher prices because they're seeing more demand, right? So I think there's an interesting way to kind of cater to both groups. And I kind of feel that you can only uniquely do that on mobile. To be quite honest. Or I guess you could do it if you had the right game akin to a Fortnite or a Among Us or a Fall Guys that felt very culturally relevant and was free to play and could reach a lot of people.
So I think that's a really great segue. One of the recent videos that I did was on how quickly are we going to see mainstream adoption of Web3 gaming. And in that I looked at the overall adoption curves of the internet and crypto more broadly. And I think we see that similar evolution beginning to occur in Web3 gaming. But usually it's slow at first and then kind of picks up in the middle. And then the last percentages are also very slow.
Yeah.
Based on your observations and, as you talk to other builders, when do you think that we get to mainstream adoption of Web3 games?
If I had to guess, I would say 5 to 7 years, which for me, in retrospect, I could be wrong. And maybe that's a little bit too optimistic. Like it could turn out to be 7 to 10 years. I wouldn't be surprised, but I do think it's inevitable. I think that you're going to see the first hits in this sort of second generation of Web3 native games within the next 1 to 3 years. You may see, if I had to guess, you might see a couple of launches of alphas and betas that have already happened or are happening later this year that once they go through their cycle sometime next year could get some real traction and then be kind of seen as, potential successes, which might move the sort of back of the train people from the establishment, gaming companies to adopt more quickly. Although I think we all know there's certain companies like Ubisoft, and I'm forgetting all of the others, even legacy companies like Atari, who are already kind of bought in, but it remains to be seen like when their products are coming to market, they might be a little more slow because they're typically making bigger AAA games. So I don't know. If I had to guess, I would say we're going to see some hits in this next cycle within the next 1 to 3 years, and probably it will be at least a handful, if not a couple dozen, and again, mega hits versus like moderate hits. I don't know. But I would say by like 5 years, I would expect us to have crossed this chasm to where everyone kind of in the entire gaming industry knows that this is inevitable. And maybe a large portion, if not a slight majority, are now moving in this direction or are close. And maybe even some who haven't moved yet are feeling FOMO and feeling like they're too late. I would be surprised if that's not starting to happen within 5 years.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that makes sense. That also tracks with what I'm expecting also. So looking at the overall funding landscape for Web3 games, there's about 300 publicly funded games that I've seen in the last couple of years. And, of those, like you said, I do expect to see a few dozen, two, three, 4 dozen that actually have some sort of success and longevity. And from
Mhm.
that group, most of those games, it's going to be between 3 and 5 to 7 years that like their life cycle is going to run, where they've got
Yeah,
pretty consistent users. And so I think that gets us there by 2028, 2029 time period at the
yeah.
latest.
Yeah, but I also think like we will see evidence of the sort of next wave of games that feel different than the kind of group that we've all seen the last year or two. I think we've either already seen them in alpha or beta, or we're about to, and it might be clear to us all within the next 6 to 18 months that like there are some really promising titles here that like we're all feeling really optimistic about. Now we're all super early, so it's going to take some time. Like look at Axie Infinity, right? Like it took probably 2+ years. I don't even know, it could be more, but 2+ years at least for them to get to that crescendo moment, where they were, I think close to 2 million daily active users at the peak, right?
Right.
So right. It's still going to take any new game that amount of time to go through its cycle to get to that crescendo moment at the earliest, right? From where they are now, it's probably 1 to 2 years at least.
Mhm.
You know?
So so this is one of the parts that I have to say I love about the Web3 space is so many of the builders here and the community, I would say, is very interconnected, and everyone kind of feels like we're
Yeah.
building towards the same thing with this overall paradigm. Can you share one or two projects other than Artie that you're impressed by, or maybe you're excited to see how it goes when they launch?
Yeah. A couple. One would be Doodles. I just think that Doodles has a really like cool and sophisticated brand. Like as far as brand goes, I would say that theirs to me is like the most interesting and kind of like they've executed really well upon it. I feel like with a lot of their brand activations and just like the synergy across all the things they do feels really clear to me. Um, and the other one I would say is Lost Runes Wizard Cult, which one of the founders of that was our former art director in our earliest days when we were still kind of an AI company. So we have like a deep, love for that project and think that they've done a lot of cool things. And we share a lot in common with them. But if I look at what they've done, I think they've done a lot of great things really well.
Yeah, that's great. And both of those projects, I think, have very strong communities. Also, that's a really
Yeah.
persistent part of their success.
For us, it's exciting because we did like a very early access NFT drop, which we call season one, 6+ months before our game alpha, which we're, now on the precipice of, about a month or so from now. So, for us, we've been treading water a little bit, trying to hold back a bit on some of our bigger initiatives, ratcheting up our marketing, because we kind of also knew, you don't want to get too ahead of your skis before you actually have that thing you're promising, which in our case is a game and a gaming ecosystem. So for us, we kind of look at like late August and into like late September as the beginning of this cycle where we get into this kind of private alpha for probably about 10,000 players max. It'll probably be capped. And then we get to a private beta probably towards the end of the year, so rather quickly for maybe up to 100,000 players. And then by early to mid Q1, we're in public beta kind of soft launch where we're spending some serious marketing dollars on user acquisition beyond the existing crypto community or NFT community. So for us, that's really exciting, but also like it's been challenging because we're just getting started, but we've kind of had to tread water a little bit through this bear market like a lot of projects have, and just stay focused on the goal. And that's not always easy for communities because certain people have different incentives. So some really want to be trading and flipping and getting liquidity, and others are willing to wait and they see the kind of promise. So it's interesting because you have to kind of reconcile different priorities within your community, and that can be challenging. Some projects are more straightforward where everyone kind of has a similar priority, but with these kind of gaming projects in particular, I think you have different profiles of people who kind of come for different reasons.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that challenge of continuing to build while keeping the community engaged, as you're preparing to launch, is going to continue to be an issue that we see in Web3 gaming, just because the gaming development life cycle is longer than most other industry life cycles for product development. I think one of the real important elements is to have good partners that you can lean on, that can support you through that. This was actually one of the pieces that I was most intrigued by when I saw the Artieverse lineup of supporters and and backers when you announced the project. What are some of the partners that you've benefited from the most, and what's the value they're providing you other than financial, of course?
Yeah, we've been really fortunate to have incredible backers. And these are all very talented, busy people, who, a lot of which are operators who've built successful companies. So whether it's, Chad Hurley, one of the founders of YouTube, which, my co-founder worked for him for a long period of time, and kind of getting to hear some of his insights surrounding starting YouTube and how pioneering embedded videos in websites and in MySpace comments allowed them to reach a larger audience and kind of like ride off of the back of MySpace by being in MySpace comments and eventually Facebook. That's not dissimilar from kind of what we're doing with gaming. So that's been really intriguing. One of our investors and advisors is the chief product officer of Roblox. So getting to really talk to like a expert product mind who's been, at Zynga, at Xbox, and now Roblox is really been helpful for us. And, we have some really big financial institutions who are backing us, even some of which I'm not even supposed to talk about because they're very secretive. But these are like kind of like hedge fund, crossover type of folks, like a lot of New York kind of, big money funds. So we've had the fortune of working with some of them. And, other founders who we talk to maybe less frequently, but we have deep respect for, like John Oringer, the founder of Shutterstock, Mark Pincus, the founder of Zynga, some certain kind of celebrity investors like Scooter Braun and Kevin Durant and Naomi Osaka. So there's some really interesting people in our corner. They help us in different ways, and some have yet to really help us in the way that we know that they can help us, because it's not their time yet, right? So we kind of have in our minds these ideas of like when all these people can support us, and we really try to create like a vast network of investors and sort of like a lot of surface area, because what we realized is if you get people to invest, particularly angels, like with their own money, they really do want to be helpful because it is their own money, and the more surface area you create, the more potential for serendipity you have, or intros or things like this.
Yeah. So that's also a good segue. One of the kind of ethos of the Web3 space is the concept of the DAO and community engagement. So not just like early funders and backers of the project, but everyone who's a gamer in this case, or part of the IP experience. What's your take on the DAO structure? I think we've seen some positives, some negatives over the past few years emerge. What do you and the Artieverse think about DAOs in general?
We're really intrigued. We talk about DAOs fairly often. However, I think we're taking a more measured approach, which is, I don't think for us it makes sense to become a DAO or sort of build a DAO within our community even until we get a bit further with our game launch and kind of see how things work. So we just don't want to put the cart before the horse in that sense. So I think at some moment it will become, abundantly clear that maybe either that's the direction to go or it is not. I think we're already seeing with certain DAOs, it's a better fit for certain businesses than others. It also, like, from a management standpoint, it can become quite complicated too. So I think whoever wants to start a DAO should just think very critically about, like, are they the right type of business to do so, and are they the right type of people who are going to really benefit from that?
Yeah, I think it's easy for us to take the approach, well, if total centralization is something we want to avoid, well, then therefore total decentralization is the optimal condition. And that's not necessarily the case, right? It's probably somewhere along that spectrum that you want to land, and it depends on the use cases and the outcome you're shooting for.
Yeah, it's different for 100%. It's a spectrum. I like usually look at things in life like they're spectrums rather than like binary. So I think that's definitely true here.
Yeah. So definitely, the community in Discord, I'm a part of. Just, full disclosure, obviously, for anyone watching the video. I minted at the initial launch of Artieverse, like I shared with you earlier. If someone really hasn't heard a lot of Artie, but they're really interested in sort of that intersection of music and gaming and, culture, what were some ways that they should get involved? How could they find out more about you, or, if they want to follow the project from early days here?
Yeah, well, they should follow us on Twitter at the Artieverse. They should join our Discord at discord.gg/Artie, and they should go to our website, artie.com. So those are the kind of three destinations for now to pay attention to. And then in terms of timing, yeah, like we're looking at a second NFT collection in the near future. We're looking at the launch of the alpha version of our first game, and then kind of pushing towards more games thereafter in sort of this open ecosystem. So, yeah, and lastly, I guess I didn't fully address this, but yeah, the culture piece, the music, kind of the merch, the live events, that stuff's really important to us. I know you see a lot of that in the NFT space, but the comment I wanted to make is I believe the next great gaming company, prolific gaming company, will need to be a 360-degree entertainment juggernaut, and that their wedge into youth culture may be gaming, like in our case, games on social with ownable game assets in the form of NFTs. But that's not enough. Like, you need to also embrace merch drops and community events and potentially esports and film and TV. And there's only one gaming publisher that I can think of that's moving in that direction. It's Riot Games. I know a lot of their earlier fans are somewhat annoyed that they're making like mobile games now, and they've got TV shows on Netflix, they've got esports and live events, they've got merch, but they are kind of, to me, looking like as close as they could be to a modern Disney, like that mind map from Walt Disney of how everything kind of connects to everything else. But when I look at other establishment gaming companies, I can't even really think of another one that cares about community, that cares about culture, and that has tentacles in other media in a significant way. So for me, that's really important. If you want to be a gaming company, that's resonant in culture, you can't just be a gaming company.
And I thought we saw that with the NYC NFT events, and some of the videos. I may put some clips into this for those that missed it. But really, that concept of making this an entire entertainment experience, where the IP is just completely immersive in your time you're playing gaming, but also in in music or in movies and so on as you're watching it. I think that's a really unique future. And actually, that's one of the ways that I think when we talk about the metaverse, this may evolve. So most people, when they're
Yeah.
using the term metaverse now, they're really talking about these sort of interoperable platforms. So if you want to take your Artie from Artieverse and you want to put it out in in Otherside or in Illuvium or whatever, wouldn't it be nice if we had all of these NFTs that could interoperate between these systems? That's
Yeah.
one way of looking at it, and I would say that's maybe like a horizontal type of landscape. But it almost
Right.
strikes me that you're looking at more of a vertical integration of the metaverse between the
Right.
gaming universe as well as entertainment and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's like maybe a few IPs historically that you could say were actually metaverses all along if you look at it through that vertical slice, like Mickey Mouse, right? Like, he is everywhere. He's on lunchboxes, he's on your phone, he's on your watch, he's in movies, he's on rides, he's on merch, like where is he not, right? You could possibly say that about probably one of the most prolific brands in the world, Hello Kitty, is kind of especially in certain markets, everywhere. You could say that about Pokemon. You could say that about Star Wars, right? And some of them started with traditional kind of filmed entertainment as their wedge, and others with games or trading cards. So I think it makes sense that in this day and age, a lot of the next great IP will be built as Web3 native or gaming native. But yeah, look, like this idea of like having this really high fidelity immersive world, say in VR, with 10,000 players at once, like that's a component of what I think many people think the metaverse is, but that's sort of more, in my view, like surface level. I think now, kind of post VR, AR hype cycle, most people now view the metaverse just as equally as being Fortnite on a TV screen or on a mobile screen, right? It's sort of it's a state of mind in a way, just as much as it is or more the platform you're playing it on, you know, or the technology you're using.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good way to look at it. So one of the pieces that I'm really excited about, anyone who's listening to this video with us now, you're really early to the space, and having a front row seat to watch this whole thing be created is just going to be wild for the next decade or so. So maybe as we wrap up for today, any final thoughts that you'd like to share with the Artie community that's watching, or anyone new who's just discovering it, about Web3 gaming in general?
Yeah, I guess if you're seeing this, as people say, you are early, and congratulations. It's great to be early, and it's a lot of fun. Like, I think we'll all look back on these times as probably, the most fun that we'll have. Is these early building phases. And historically, if you look at other, entertainment companies or tech companies, the early days are like celebrated, right? So we're in that now, and we should enjoy it, despite the fact that we're conceivably in a potential recession or bear market in the summer of 2022. We still have a lot to be optimistic about. And I think for Artie, like, we're just trying to do something different. We're trying to, really take like a grand slam swing with what we're doing. Like, we think if it works, it could be profoundly impactful to kind of bring really cool games to an ignored group of people on their phones, where they spend all their time with game assets they can truly own. And for me, it's really about that player empowerment movement or player ownership movement. One thing you could say is, like, people talk a lot about games as a service, as like a business model, with games like Fortnite and others. I think we're moving to sort of a games as community model and a games as culture model. And the only way to do that is through empowering players, in my view, to be creators, participants, and owners. And owners, I think, is the last piece that Web3 is really bringing. So yeah, I'll end there, but it's been a pleasure speaking with you, and I've been a fan of all the videos you've been making so far. So keep it up.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think I'm if I can just help drive more individuals, whether they're a gamer or an investor or a builder, to really just give a long look at the space, it's better for all of us, because, like you said, that ownership aspect and that stronger sense of empowerment is exactly what I think we need, just in general as a species right now, frankly. And so just a note for our watchers, in the description below, I'm going to put links to all of the sites that Ryan mentioned for Artieverse, as well as a couple of the other videos and such that we mentioned during the recording. So feel free to check us out. If you like the content, give me a like or subscribe also. Want to continue bringing you more content. And Ryan, it was a real pleasure. Appreciate your time today sharing with us Artieverse. And I look forward to joining you and the rest of the team as we progress toward launches later this year.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks again. And we'll be talking soon. Take care.
Awesome. Appreciate it.